Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of More to It. I'm Jason McConnell.
And I'm Todd Norton. Welcome, everybody. Before we get started, we need to read our disclaimer. Of course, the views, thoughts, and analysis and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and the podcast participants. They do not necessarily reflect the views of Boise State University, the University of Wyoming, or either of those universities' governing bodies. No endorsement of the material contained in this podcast by those entities is implied. Jason, what are we talking about today?
I okay, so I think it's fair to say you and I are kind of a nerdy bunch. We talk about a bunch of nerdy stuff on the regular, and just recently our conversation drifted to something that we've both been trained in: fundamental attribution error. Now, I don't know that we could get more nerdy than that, maybe because we're kind of talented that way. But here we are, fundamental attribution error. I want to talk about it because as I meander through the daily, seeing stuff in the news, watching other people's podcasts, listening to people talk about other folks just in daily life,
Yeah.
my mind says fundamental attribution error. And I know that's weird. I'm just looking for somebody like you to talk about it with. What do you think? Are you game?
I am.
Good.
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree with you though. It is among the one of the geekiest perhaps conversations we could have, but it's also right from that perspective is also a very cool conversation to have.
Well, yeah, and if we're not going to talk about it with each other, I mean, who would tolerate us? I don't know. So, okay, let's start with what in the world is fundamental attribution error? Let's start there.
So I'll give you my take and then right
Okay.
how I learned it. So I learned
Cool.
fundamental attribution error as coming out of psychology literature. And it is a tendency at the individual level to associate any positive thing that I experience as being part of my positive character, and any negative right outcome in my life as being due to context. And then you flip that around, and that any positive outcome for someone else is being due to context, and any negative right experience or outcome or accomplishment right or whatever in their life being due to their character.
Yep.
We almost need a grid, but you get the idea, right? And so
Yeah.
if you experience something positive, I'm like, oh, well, McConnell must have had help on whatever, so on and so forth. Whereas if I experience something good, well, that's because I worked really hard at it. How did you learn it?
Okay. So I learned nearly the exact same concept that you just described, except I was first introduced to it in grad school in a series of classes on political psychology. And of course, there are some strains of political psychology that focus on the individual. That's true, but that's not the classes I was in. I was in a bunch of classes talking about things like why do people commit genocide? And so inherently, the subject matter of the classes I was in was some sort of group dynamic. And of course, we talked about, some of the big ones. We talked about the Holocaust. We talked about genocide in Rwanda decades ago. And so I learned fundamental attribution error in the context of why would one group of people think they were so much better than another group that they happen to think were so bad for a bunch of reasons. But being the geeky guy that I am, I came up with a grid. You mentioned that. I'm wearing a window pane shirt today just to stick with the theme. Can I share it with you?
Of course, I like Venn
Okay.
diagrams. You like grids.
Okay. Okay. Yes. All right. So this is how I was taught fundamental attribution error. So, how do we think about somebody's success or somebody's failure as a group of people? How do we think about that compared to, a comparison between people we identify with? That's what the psychology crowd would label an in group, or somebody else. an out group, somebody that's in a different group. And maybe it's a group in opposition. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just somebody different from you. No conflict, just different. And so the way I learned it was if you see somebody in your group who is successful, or you see a group that you identify with as achieving success, you say something like, oh my gosh, all their hard work, it paid off. Look at their education. They worked so hard. Of course they were successful. Look at them. At the same time, echoing what you said just a second ago, if somebody inside your group fails, or maybe your group as a whole fails, you look at that and blame it on circumstance. External factors beyond the individual or group's control. Well, they just did their best, and it just didn't work out for them this time. It just didn't fall into place. We've all heard explanations like that. The out group column over there on the right hand side, success is attributed to luck, maybe outside help, maybe it's attributed to cheating. They only got there because they did something inappropriate. They only won because they did something nefarious. They broke the rules. Of course, at the same time, if you're looking at the out group and you see failure, you attribute that to a lack of skill, lack of character, and you perceive that failure as just being something that was inevitable. Of course, they failed. They're bad people. Of course, that was their outcome. And so it was really interesting to me as a much younger guy, thinking about how groups treat each other, how they interact with each other, how they talk to each other and about each other publicly, thinking about it within this framework. I just thought was interesting.
That makes sense to me, right? And so we had talked a little bit about this before the show, and I was thinking about your frame of reference, right? Coming from right. So I came from psychology and soc, right? And there are varying scales of analysis there as well, right? And so I was interested because policy and governance is not my expertise by any stretch. So I was interested, and so I found an article that I thought was kind of similar. I want to share that just because I thought it was interesting. So I'm going to share my screen here really quickly, and this was the piece that I thought was so. This is you have political trust and ultimate attribution error explaining success and failed policy initiatives. Right, again, clearly in your frame, in your domain than mine. I have highlighted here the piece that I thought was interesting. The success of a policy initiative was explained more in terms of positive disposition of the authoring party when the initiative came from a trusted political party than when it came from a distrusted party. And an initiative's failure was explained more in terms of these lack of positive dispositions when the initiative came from a distrusted party. It feels like that's kind of similar. Right now,
Agreed.
we're talking about policy there specifically, and there's lots of other political rhetoric we could discuss, but it felt at least kind of similar in that. Is that consistent with what you're thinking about?
Yeah, I think that tracks. If we were to look at something like press conferences offered up by members of Congress describing some sort of legislation they were cranking out, if any given party wants to do a press conference on something they've passed and they're very proud of it, they're going to say something at the press conference that sounds like this. We really came together as a team. We worked very hard to represent the people. We heard the grassroots movement. We've listened to you. We're doing the good work of the nation.
All of which may be true, by the way.
100%. It might be true. But like right down the hallway is a competing press conference where the opposition is going to say something that sounds like this. Well, the majority leader manipulated the calendar to set the debate at a time most inopportune for our members,
For sure.
shutting out our constituents' voices. Only through chicanery like this were they able to pass this policy, which is horrible for the nation.
Yep.
And of course, I'm being both hyperbolic and generic, but come on. If we turned on C-SPAN right now, I'd say there's like two chances out of three that we're going to see speeches like that.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that article is neat. I wasn't familiar with it till you showed it just now. Neat. And I think that generally tracks. That makes sense to me.
So I want to extend here a little bit, right? So I'm interested in what you're talking about as far as in group and out group,
Yeah.
right? And then take that idea and extend it just a little bit, right? So I tend to agree with policies or the ideas, the principles, whatever the case might be, for one party over another, whichever party that might be, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And if those are the sorts of explanations that I hear all of the time, does that over time have some collected impact, do you think, on sort of, right, so you're in this party, I'm in this party, so I start thinking a whole bunch of stuff about you and you start thinking a bunch of stuff about me, and you see where I'm going?
Yeah.
Right? Does it create a sort of a political discourse bubble, if you will?
I think it does. Um, I've got some wonderful colleagues who are doing very good work talking about political polarization and just generally the idea that Americans are more divided in terms of what they agree about and what they disagree about. This has been a cyclical thing throughout national history, but we're in one of those cycles right now where there is a lot of polarization. And so thinking about fundamental attribution error in this group dynamic, are you one of us or are you not? Are you with us or are you against us? That kind of dynamic. If you've got people that are generally distrustful of each other and you've got some sort of media environment that feeds that disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
Now you've got this self-fulfilling prophecy that people not only don't trust each other across groups, across party lines, so to speak. You've also got a dynamic where they've got a very different perception of what people are doing, what their motive is, what is real success, what is real failure. And I think all of these things that we've been babbling on about today contribute to this notion that Americans may be living next door to each other, they may be working side by side, but they might actually be experiencing American life as something very different from each other. We hear quips from time to time that R's and D's are living in completely different worlds.
Sure.
I think that's true to some degree. We may all be eating the same, food from the same grocery store. We may be driving the same type of car. Okay, but that's not what that quip is about. I think the information dynamic is really interesting. What do you think about it?
Well, while you were talking, and I hadn't thought about this at all before, but while you were talking, I was thinking about a clip that I often show in class when I'm trying to get students to think about sort of the evolution of media, right? So I'll show them some clips from, say, back in Cronkite's or Murrow's sort of time, right? And we sort of move forward, and what I'm trying to get them sensitive to is sort of the way the medium itself, right? Sort of medium theory, and getting them thinking about how media actually presents itself. Right. And so I show a clip from the first day of literally the opening day of CNN, right? Because the broadcast structure looks just totally different than today. Right.
So different.
I mean, entirely different as far as how topics get introduced, or how much time is talked about topics, the way topics are talked about, all of those sorts of things. Yep. And there's this clip, and sorry that's a little long-winded, but there's this clip from Jon Stewart visiting, this is going to date me a little bit, visiting Crossfire. if you remember.
Wow, that's an
Yeah.
oldie. Okay.
Yes. And he's chastising Stewart, that is sitting at the end of the table, and on his right is no, is on his left is Paul Bagala, and on his left is Tucker Carlson, or the opposite way. It doesn't matter, really matter.
Doesn't matter.
On one
Yeah.
side of the table is Paul Bagala, and on the other side is Tucker Carlson, and they're starting to talk about it. And he opens this with, "Why do you do what you do? And can you please stop?" And it supports this idea, right, that media at that point in time, and there's an article that that they read where we read about this, where it's media as argument culture,
Yeah.
right? That sort of the way that the media ends up framing things, it doesn't matter what it is, right, is this argument between two sides. And in a sense, Crossfire, and there was a couple of other shows like it at the time, Crossfire was this wonderful sort of example of, you just get two people on one side and two people on the other side, and we just argue across the table the entire time, right?
So
Not really having discussion or discourse, as you might, or right, but we have an argument.
I had completely forgotten about Crossfire. It was on for a lot of seasons. Wasn't that Chris Matthews' show for a while?
It may have been, I don't know.
Um, that's really interesting. I had completely forgotten about that.
But in a sense, as far as our connection here, I think it's a good connection to what we're talking about here, because we're talking about how those conversations, and in a sense, it's almost like, if we're going to take Crossfire as an example, we're no longer even sitting at the same table.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we were for a while sitting at the same table and arguing, and in a sense, right, sort of our bubble, right, or our table has just become kind of separated from one another. And that's what it feels like anyway, oftentimes. Not always, but often.
So that leads me to a couple of thoughts that I think we should touch on right now, but I would love it if we could come back to these two topics in a future show, or maybe it's multiple shows. Um, you mentioned a few moments ago about how the media had changed, showing some sort of like origin of CNN. What does CNN look like under Ted Turner back in the day compared to today? That got me to thinking I would love to do a show talking about the evolution of media. It is so different. It is so different today
Yeah.
in format, style, audience, mission, the funding model. I think so much of it has changed. I would love to have somebody on the show to talk about that.
Even the legal framework, right? Even the legal framework of their organization, right, has changed, and sort of like moving from a news organization into info. I mean, in legally, I believe infotainment sort of structure to some degree.
So that's interesting too. Back in the era where CNN is standing up for the first time, you had so many more corporate players in the media. Over the ensuing handful of decades, wow, so many consolidations,
Yeah.
so many just going out of business. And so I would love to talk about that too, just because we used to have more of a mosaic of perspectives, and now it's just a handful in the mainstream corporate media sphere. It really is not the number that it used to be. It's so much smaller.
I think there's an additional challenge. I hope I didn't cut you off.
No, well, I'm going to come back to the second thing I want to talk about. But
Oh, okay. Then I'll
first.
stop.
No,
go ahead. And I think there's an additional challenge when you look at social media, right? So you have this emergence of social media. And sorry, if I just took your point from you, I apologize.
No, it's good. Yeah, go.
Right? Because the algorithm itself on many social media platforms often, I think, reinforces our exposure to a narrowed set of ideas, regardless of what it is, right? And so you have this tremendous opportunity of only hearing from a certain number of voices. You hear that sort of in a sense, right? You'll see that, say, on TikTok or other sorts of media platforms. Sort of, how do I get on the other side of this media platform? Somehow I got sort of caught on the liberal side or the conservative side, or whatever the case may be. And it's interesting to me because I'm often searching out people who have intelligent sorts of conversations, right, and are
Yeah.
interesting from a completely different standpoint because that's the way that I tend to approach things. Go ahead.
So that is exactly what I was going to bring up.
Well, I'm sorry, I stole your
Uh,
point.
no, it's good because it makes me feel less wacky. No, I would love to talk about that in depth. Maybe we do that in a future show. We should look around and see if we know somebody that wants to come on and talk about it with us. Um, One of the most eye-opening experiences I ever had online was a number of years ago where I went on my Facebook profile. I went into the settings and changed my gender.
Oh,
I just flipped my gender on my Facebook profile, clicked the save button or whatever it was called at the time, and then watched the cascade effect of what popped up in my feed, what popped
interesting.
up on my profile. It was completely eye opening. And so then I just went right down the rabbit hole. I went back and changed my gender back to male, but I started changing my birthday and I started changing my marital status, my
Interesting.
relationship status. Every single one of those settings on your profile contributes to the way the algorithm chooses what to show you and what to not show you. Now, this was, I'm going to date myself, but holy cow, this was like 15 years ago that I was just messing around one day doing this. I see the same kind of thing you're talking about, though, across the platforms. I'm not just trying to, somehow pick on Facebook. Hey, Zuck, please don't sue me. I'm not trying to do that at all. I see the same thing on TikTok. About, I don't know, 2 months ago, somehow I got on baby hippo TikTok. I got nothing against baby hippos. They're kind of weird looking. They're kind of cute. Based on the videos I've seen, they look like some sort of weird, smooth dog creature following humans around, wanting a snack. But I don't have the foggiest idea how I ended up on baby hippo talk.
Yeah.
How did that happen? Um, just as magically as I got there, after about 2 weeks, I didn't see any baby hippo posts ever again. And so the algorithm, how does it work? Well, that's proprietary. They won't
Yeah.
tell you.
But it is fascinating, right? And you can see some evidence of how the thing's working, right? I've been on horse TikTok now and I have no idea how I got there. I've
Are you
never
a horse
been
guy, my
around
friend?
horses. I've never owned horses, been around horses. I have no idea. And I don't mind. It's fine. It's just how I don't. That's an
How?
interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I think the algo is neat. Bringing our conversation back to fundamental attribution error, I do think specifically across the tech platforms, it's self reinforcing.
Yeah.
And it's self reinforcing in a way that we didn't experience through cable TV news, that we didn't really experience through print media, newspapers, magazines. But because the tech platforms can use they can use metrics to track not only what you like or dislike, what you watch or don't watch. They can track how much time you spend there. Now I hear everybody talking about impressions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more than just clicks. It's more than likes. It's more than that. It's how much time you linger. And I've seen metrics down in the fraction of a second, comparing impressions down at that level.
Yeah.
And so if they're including that kind of metric, coming back to the topics we were discussing at the top of the show, wow. So if the algorithm is set up to show you more of what you like, it's not going to take very much time on any given tech platform because before all of its suggestions are going to basically be more of the same. And I
Yeah.
think that gets right to your observation about Crossfire. Now people are no longer at the same table. They're sitting in separate buildings,
Yeah.
not across the table from each other at all.
So on a practical level, like if we want to be exposed to different opinions and different takes on things, you have to, in a sense, almost make a conscious effort to go out there and search for differences of opinion, different content creators, if you're in a social media platform, right, that give you a different vantage point, different perspective on things. And that's
Yeah.
challenging because in a sense we all jump on social media, right,
Do you,
to
do
for
you do that kind of
enjoyment.
thing?
What's that?
Do you do that kind of thing, Todd? Do you go out looking for
Absolutely.
other stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I try to follow content creators because they have expertise in an area that I don't know much about.
Yeah. Um, these days, I do a fair bit of the same. If I run across a creator, if I run across someone saying an interesting idea, I'll look them up online. Hey, do you have a profile?
Yep.
Of course, I'm not asking them, but I'm flipping through looking for them. If I can find their account, I'll follow, see what they have to say. Something I used to rely on was my friend group, especially in college. I had a very diverse friend group, people from all over the country, some folks from around the world too, for that matter, people from different religions that I had no familiarity with at all. I would rely on them in this regard. They would post stuff. I would follow my friends. I would read their posts. They would tag me in things. Hey, McConnell, what do you think about this? And then it became a vehicle for conversation. But I'm going to say in the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years, I see fewer and fewer people engaging in that kind of behavior online.
Yeah.
At first, I just thought it was a change among my friend group. Oh, I chalked it up as we're all getting older. We're up, we got families, we got commitments. We don't hang out on social media as much as we used to. But as I talk to people in my daily, more and more people are telling me the same thing. They see fewer and fewer other opinions, and it's both within their friends and other folks too.
Yeah, there's a person, oil and gas expert that I follow, and I don't understand petroleum or energy policy that much, and it's a complicated area. I mean, it is massively complicated, and so I follow him because that's his area of expertise. And to affirm what you're talking about, and it's not something I personally experience, but I watch. If that content creator posts something that's critical, say, of a statement that the Harris or the Biden Harris administration made, suddenly, like, everybody who's sort of pro that administration, right, just absolutely roast him. And then it'll be a day later he'll make a similar commentary and
Yeah.
critique of something the Trump administration, or right, sort of that side, and then people from that side will come after him, right? And his perspective is fairly consistently, I'm just trying to bring verified information, given that I have X number of years of policy experience, and right, well, not just policy but experience in the oil and gas industry. So being sort of a neutral expert
Yeah.
in it seems to be increasingly challenging.
Oh my gosh, it's a tough time to be walking down the stripe in the middle of the highway.
Yes.
It's tough. Hey, one of the things that got me to thinking about fundamental attribution error was last week. I saw online someone post something very similar to what you were talking about. It wasn't on oil and gas, it was about another national policy. And this particular poster made this statement, this policy, and he named it, will not change regardless of who wins the presidential election in November.
Oh, interesting.
Trump believes this, Harris believes that. That means the policy is going to stay the same in this context. If you're worried about this problem, don't expect either of these politicians to solve it. Okay, so coming back to fundamental attribution error, holy cow. The poster started taking fire from both sides. People were posting comments back claiming him to be some ist for this reason and ist for that reason. And you could tell from reading the comments which people were Trump supporters and which people were Harris supporters. And they were very critical. but all of them were taking shots at this guy for saying, look, these two politicians are same on this topic. They're the same.
Yeah.
Um, well, all of the commenters were coming at it from this guy's in the out group.
Yes.
This guy's in the out group, so let's come at him hard. Let's attack him. It's one of the things that got me to thinking about fundamental attribution error, even though I haven't had it's not exactly what I do on the daily.
No,
Uh,
me either. But it's a useful concept to help us understand what's going on in the media, right in policy or politic,
yeah.
um, political domain
So,
right now.
hey, what do you think? Do you want to have somebody on talking about evolution of media?
I think we absolutely should. Yes, I think it would be useful because I think so much of what we're experiencing, right, sort of our experience of these issues ends up being not because of, right, but the media play a significant role. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes we forget that media used to function differently.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of talking with my children, and they've never lived a life without GPS on their phone ever.
Yeah, it's a similar
Um,
dynamic.
yeah, I mean, it's like that, right? Well, hey, I think we should wrap the show up today. It's been a lot of fun talking about something super nerdy. But let's come back around to a few of these topics. Let's see if we can get somebody to talk about evolution of media.
Strong agree. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. I'm Todd Norton.
I'm Jason McConnell. Bye bye.
Have a great day.